بده يحكي شيء قبل البروجيكسيون introduction كنا نسأله؟ ايه بليز.
I am not Jalal Toufic. Jalal had to travel, so he asked me last Tuesday if I could take his place, if I could, and read a text that he has published in one of his many books entitled Distracted. And he also asked me if I could show a few minutes of the opening scene of Alain René's film Hiroshima Mon Amour, by way of illustrating one of the two concepts that this particular text attempts to elaborate. Over the week, I've tried to practice reading the text. And I found out that if I were to simply recite the text, it may not communicate well, because for one thing, I don't have that authorial confidence. So I spoke with Jalal and I told him that what I would do is, in as much as I can, read parts of the text and comment on them, and in a sense try to bring in some of my own reading of his work as I go along. If that sounds a bit simplistic as I go along, I apologize. I thought in a sense I would read the text with you, a text written by someone else who's not here, and try together, if possible, try to make sense of two concepts and what I would consider to be a task. The two concepts he terms as, one of them is what Jalal calls a radical closure. The second concept is what he calls a surpassing disaster. And the third task is one that he calls excavation. And Jalal Toufic considered that these three notions are relevant to those of you who are making film or video in post-war Lebanon. Although his work often suggests that these concepts are also relevant to other cities that are living the trauma of post-wars. So let's begin first with the first concept, which he calls again radical closure. Toufic writes, he says, much of Lebanese photography remained at the level of artistic documentation. This is the photography that was produced after the war. For instance, the work of Samir Muqdad and that of Fuad al-Khouri, who were both treating and have continued to treat the civil war and war as a disaster, and the closure that affected Lebanon as relative, albeit extreme. But aside from this kind of work, we encounter two kinds of works that are symptomatic and emblematic of a Lebanon that was, during part of the war years, a radical closure and/or a surpassing disaster. Where is the rest of the world? What is the world doing? How is the world allowing such atrocities not only to happen, but also to go on, being perpetuated for months and years? The incredible desertion of the world is the leitmotif of the indignant exclamations one hears in zones under siege. The Palestinians and the Lebanese in West Beirut during the Israeli siege of that city in 1982, the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip since the start of their closures, then sieges by the Israelis, the inhabitants of Sarajevo during its siege by Bosnian Serbs, the Tutsi minority during the Rwandan genocide of 1994, the Iraqis since the start in 1990 of the ongoing sanctions. Therefore, is it strange that some feel or make artworks that imply that these places became radical closures? Can we detect in such places one of the consequences of radical closures, which is what Toufic calls unworldly, fully formed, ahistorical eruptions? So for Jalal, one of the ways we recognize that a location has been radically closed is through a particular symptom, which he calls, again, an unworldly, fully formed, ahistorical eruption, an event, right, that cannot be accounted for in a particular narrative, historical narrative. Or if you think of the medium of film or video, it is an eruption that cannot be understood diegetically. As usual, it is most appropriate to look for that kind of symptom in artworks. And this is, again, a particular characteristic I find in Jalal Toufic's work is that he argues the relevance of a theory by pointing to specific artworks, and seldom does he take his theoretical constructs to be tested, let's say, in the social political world. I don't think this, on his behalf, this is a way to avoid accountability, but rather I think in his work he always opens up a possibility, right? Keeps it at the level of a theoretical structure, and I think and leaves the reader the chance to deploy it. So he looks again at artworks, and he mentions, for example, as an example of an ahistorical eruption, a work by Walid entitled The Document. And this is a document that Walid in a lecture he gave at Surso Museum, attributed to Jubran Khalil Jubran, a kind of a lost document that he discovered. Another ahistorical eruption are a number of photographs that also Walid presented as part of a lecture that he aptly entitled Miraculous Beginnings. If I were to again again, I'm allowing myself to do this commentary. I hope this is not disturbing you, but I think this notion of the miraculous, to use the vocabulary of Walid or the historical eruption, to use Jalal Toufic's vocabulary, I think can be found locally in debates that have been at least taking place in Arabic newspapers since the early 1990s under the general heading of, in Arabic would be istinaf. Right? Al-istinaf is a difficult term to translate, but let's say it is to start anew, right? And this is an issue that has been really problematic in Lebanon after the war. How do we resume, right, living after the war? Or for those who are a bit more optimistic, how do we resume that which has been interrupted by the war? And this notion of istinaf, right, has been hotly debated, right? I mean, obviously, I'm sure you realize this, that the civil war for many has been considered a rupture, right? So how do you, in a sense, mend that which has been ruptured? And I would like to, in a sense, place this notion of an ahistorical eruption, which is again symptomatic of a radical closure, and the miraculous beginnings of Walid under the same concern that's been running, I think, in local debates for at least a decade and a half now. So these miraculous beginnings, the reader is told, are part of 29 large photographic prints and 52 documents unearthed in 1991 during the demolition of Beirut's civil war devastated central district. And according to Jalal, at least within the register of art, these can be legitimately viewed as unworldly ahistorical eruptions in the radical closure that Beirut may have become at one point. Another example Toufic gives us in order to understand this notion, again from the world of cinema, he mentions two films by Hitchcock. One of them is The Birds. And for him, the birds in the film, The Birds, are an ahistorical eruption. They cannot be accounted for or integrated in the narrative of the film. They appear, right? And for him, this is a sign that the film The Birds by Hitchcock is a film of radical closure. Right? And for him, when that happens, the boundaries that we usually, at least from a modernist point of view, we usually ascribe to a work of art, or perhaps, if we think of something a little more in socio-politically, the boundaries that we hope define a space begin to falter. They are no longer able to sustain the distinction between that which is inside and that which is outside. What happens inside the film and what happens outside the film. And so the definition of the artwork becomes problematic as these eruptions, right, signal an interference of something that is extra filmic or extra diegetic in the film. So by extension, it becomes very difficult to define the film, let's say The Birds, using modernist aesthetics, right? Or I suppose if one takes this and applies it to painting, right? The whole issue about the frame. He also, and I would like to read for you another section here, he mentions it is a conversation that took place between Hitchcock and Truffaut. And Hitchcock here is recounting to Truffaut an idea he had and which he hoped to include in another film of his entitled North by Northwest. I'll read it to you. He says, Hitchcock says, have you ever seen an assembly line? Truffaut, no, I never have. They're absolutely fantastic. Anyway, I wanted to have a long dialogue scene between Cary Grant and one of the factory workers as they walk along the assembly line. They might, for instance, be talking about one of the foremen. Behind them, a car is being assembled piece by piece. Finally, the car they've seen being put together from a simple nut and bolt is complete, with gas and oil, and all ready to drive off the assembly line. The two men look at it and say, "Isn't it wonderful?" Then they open the door to the car, and out drops a corpse. That's a great idea. Where has the body come from? Not from the car, obviously, since they've seen it start at zero. The corpse falls out of nowhere, you see. That's a perfect example of absolute nothingness, according to Hitchcock. Or rather, this is Truffaut saying. Why did you drop the idea? The answer is, we couldn't integrate the idea into the story. And this is important, I think, that there's a shift, at least in Hitchcock's conception of film, between North by Northwest and The Birds. It seems like in North by Northwest, Hitchcock insists, right, on having an integrated story. Right? In The Birds, it seems that he is willing to allow events to erupt and disintegrate the story. Therefore, I suppose that if we are to think of Lebanon as a radical closure, it is a place where we are incapable of maintaining the integrity of the story, right? To constitute, I'm sorry, it seems like I'm playing with words here, but to constitute an integral narrative, right? Things erupt. And suppose Walid Rad's proposal, right, that these photographs have been unearthed, right? These are photographs that have no author, right? But are now visible and present and potentially effective, right? In this place we live in. Now Jalal gradually takes us and adds to this first concept, the second concept, which is this notion of the surpassing disaster. And he says, we live in a block universe of space-time where nothing physically passes and vanishes, but where occasionally things withdraw due to surpassing disasters. In the book, I was lucky enough, I stumbled upon one of the many aphorisms that Jalal writes, and I found one that is particularly interesting and I think could help us clarify this concept. He writes, Lebanon, full stop, nothing left, comma, not even leaving. Again, Lebanon, nothing left, not even leaving. And obviously, if we were to stop at nothing left, this could be just another way of reiterating the same lament, right? That in this Lebanon we live in, nothing has survived, we have lost a tradition, the architecture of the city has been severely destroyed, and so forth. But then he says, not even leaving, and therefore this notion of nothing left has another meaning, right? That in Lebanon, it is not that we live in a place where we've lost so much, but rather we live in a place where there's an excess of things, because nothing left the place, everything's here. And if I can just allow myself to bring in some of my own work, I would say that this is how I understand post-war public spaces to be littered spaces. There's always an excess of material. There's an excess of words. Places are preoccupied, right, by things and people and events that we hope, right, we hoped have in a sense passed us. But rather, every time you go to a place or what we hope is a space in Beirut, you are in a sense preceded by that which came before you. In that sense, Lebanon for Jalal is again a place where nothing left. And if we read again that's the first sentence, we live in a block universe of space and time where nothing physically passes and vanishes. But where, and here this is a new idea, occasionally things withdraw due to surpassing disasters. And before I continue reading, I think it's a good time to do what Jalal asked me to do, which is to see about 5 minutes of the opening scene of Hiroshima Mon Amour, which he considers as an illustration of a place that has experienced a surpassing disaster, and where, because of that, tradition has withdrawn. So maybe we'll watch that and then. technical reasons, or perhaps this could be an otherworldly, unworldly eruption, the sound withdrew. Okay? So this is an example of tradition withdrawing because of this surpassing disaster. If you notice in the film, the camera moves from a subjective point of view. Someone is walking, looking, scanning, focusing on things. You can hear it, but there's a woman and a man talking to each other. The woman says, I've been to Hiroshima, I've seen the museum, I've seen evidence of the disaster, and the man says to her, you have seen nothing in Hiroshima. It's interesting that Jalal Toufic would use this example because in a sense he's telling us that when tradition withdraws because of this surpassing disaster, it doesn't mean that it is no longer accessible. Obviously it is there, right? We see it, we touch it, the images are there, the evidence is there, but what is lacking is the ability to witness. Right? You see the image of someone who's been scorched to death by the nuclear bomb, but your ability to witness that image seems to have withdrawn. He gives examples from Lebanon, again from works of art. And he mentions, well, let me read just a few pages, sentences. Again, Palestinians, Kurds, and Bosnians have to deal with not only the concerted erasure by their enemies of much of their tradition, the erasure by the Israelis of hundreds of Palestinian villages in 1948, and their renaming with Jewish names, and the erasure of hundreds of Kurdish villages during the Anfal operation in Iraq, etc. But also the additional, more insidious withdrawal of what survived the physical destruction. Right? So these are things that have not been physically destroyed, but are now withdrawn. The exhibition, he gives us an example here from Beirut, the exhibition entitled Wonder Beirut by Joanna Hajitouma and Khalil Jirej in 1998 revolves around a photographer who, along with her father, was commissioned by the Lebanese state in 1969 to do postcards, and who 4 years into the civil war and while shut up in his studio takes down all these postcards, which no longer referred to anything, since what they showed, Martyr Square, the souks, policemen on camels, etc., either was destroyed or no longer existed, and burns those postcards patiently, aiming at them his proper bombs and his own shells, thus making them conform better to his reality. When all was burned, it was peace. Thus the following model sequence. First, you have photographs of burned buildings and scorched walls taken by him from the window of his studio a couple of years into the conflict. Then, 4 years into the war, burned photographs that are later exhibited. And then in 1999, undeveloped photographs, a symptom of the withdrawal of the tradition past the surpassing disaster that Beirut must have become. Today, this photographer, fictional of course, and the work of Jirej and Hajitouma, this photographer no longer develops his photographs. It is enough for him to take them. At the end of the exhibition, the two artists exhibited 6,452 rolls of film that were laid on the floor, rolls containing photographs taken by the photographer but left undeveloped. Again, for Jalal, again taking example from artwork, considering it as a symptom of something that is specific to Lebanon, to the post-war Lebanon. We have these thousands of film rolls that have remained undeveloped. For him, this is an example of the withdrawal of tradition, right? This inability to develop the photographs in order to see what's around you. Something is now unreachable. Okay? Of course, we can try to elaborate on this notion. For example, I know that in Beirut, in the last, again, 15 years, often, let's say, artists or writers of my generations have been asked, sometimes criticized, for not making an effort to converse in their work with those artists and writers who came before them, who worked during the war and before the war. And I think different answers have been given, but if we take Jalal's perspective, we would say that it comes as a result of an inability, right? A painter working today, because, again, using Jalal's concept, because of this withdrawal tradition, is incapable of, right, reaching, right, manipulating, conversing with a painting by a Lebanese artist from the war or before the war. The painting is there, probably it is exhibited somewhere, but the ability to go to it, right, and integrate it in a narrative becomes difficult, according to Jalal Toufic, impossible. Now, of course, one can argue with Jalal and say it is possible, nevertheless, to converse over the gap, right? If the war is a rupture, it is possible to speak over the gap and to accept that this conversation will be necessarily and inevitably marked by the gap. And actually, as I was walking over, I remembered probably one of what I consider one of the best sculptures that have been made in Lebanon the last century, not from an aesthetic point of view, again that's irrelevant, but it's Yusuf al-Hawayik's monument for the Martyrs Monument that used to be placed in Martyrs Square before the one we have right now. It's now exhibited in the courtyard of the Surso Museum. You may want to take a walk afterwards and take a look at it. It has these two female figures facing each other. One of them is veiled, the other is not. Safira or Muhajjaba, looking at each other. Actually, not looking at each other, they're looking down. And they have their hands extended, and they seem to be laying their hands on what looks like or what I think is meant to be some sort of a burial or a coffin. Right? And of course, regardless of the historical event that called for this particular monument, I think it could be reached to think about it as a model, right, of a conversation that occurs over a gap. Here it is death itself. But here I think I'm digressing too much from Jalal Toufic's work, but again, let's see, what else? Let me close, okay, by and open the floor for discussion, if you like, by reading a little bit of what Jalal mentions as this notion of excavation, which is rather brief, and I think we just need to end with that because I think it is food for conversation. So he says, alongside the eruption of a historical, fully formed, unworldly events, and alongside the radical closure and the withdrawal of tradition, all that, Jalal considers that that another important issue, aesthetic issue and aesthetic strategy in relation to Lebanon is that of what he calls the archaeological image. He mentions many things by Gilles Deleuze, but I think I'll read to you something he says about two local films. He asks, do we witness an archaeology of the image in those sections of Danielle Arbid's film entitled Alone with War, from the year 2000, where she goes to the Sabra and Shatila Palestinian refugee camps and to the Christian town Damour, the sites of massacres and mass graves in 1982 and 1976 respectively, asking playing Palestinian children whether they have come across anything arresting while digging in their makeshift playground. Regrettably, the possibility of an archaeological image is somewhat botched, right? Because what we hear in relation to these images is not a voice-over witness. Again, the term about witnessing and the evidence, right? So instead of hearing a voice-over witness, what we hear is the voice-over of Arbid, the filmmaker, commenting on the images that we see on the screen. For him, that is a missed opportunity, right? Rather, he said, it is therefore better to look for this archaeology of the image in Paula Yaoub and Michel Lasserre's installation called Al-Manazir, or The Landscapes, from 2001, where at the corner of some of the photographs of the green landscapes of South Lebanon, one can read the inconspicuous, terse, factual information about Israel's invasion, and where, in the exhibition, where one can hear the disincarnated voice of the stretcher bearers, people who are working with the Red Cross or Red Crescent, ascend, right, we can hear their voices, ascend from this archaeological earth to relate work anecdotes and describe life during the long Israeli occupation. While in this post-war period in Lebanon, those of us who have not become zombies are suspicious of classical cinema's depth, we, right, have been working with video. And he says, as a way of a conclusion, which may explain, no doubt, along with financial reasons, why a substantial number of the most interesting Lebanese makers of audiovisual productions work in video, with its flat image rather than cinema, with its depth. For we believe in the depth of the earth where massacres have taken place and where so many have been inhumed without proper burial and still await their unearthing and then proper burial and mourning. I think with this I will end here and maybe we can have a conversation. Thank you. Comments, questions?
I try to talk in English. I begin by the end. I did not understand the meaning of the flatness of the video regarding the depth and the burial of the dead people. Could you explain more, please?
Okay, as much as I can. I think Jalal considers that the shift towards video in Lebanon, in post-war Lebanon, is analogous to the theoretical shift in cinema after the Second World War, where cinema theoreticians who used to discuss the notion of depth in the cinematic image were then began to talk about the screen as a flat image and to understand the flat image semiotically rather than to investigate the depth of the cinematic image in terms of realism. And at the time, as I understand it, this came after the events of the Second World War and the many mass graves. It seems at the time that to promise depth in an image, in a sense, was to be disloyal, right, to the depths of the earth that are now preoccupied again, that are now filled with unnamed corpses. And therefore, if cinema used to promise us depth before the Second World War, it now had to accept and suffice by presenting itself as a flat image until we find a way, right, to deal with, to narrate, right, the depth of the earth and analogously the depth of the image that is now preoccupied again by the corpse. So first, in a sense, you had to exhume, right, bring out these corpses, give them a proper burial, name them, before we can again consider that the depth of the earth, the depth of the image, is a place we can go to. I think Jalal is making the same shift, the same theoretical shift in Beirut after the war, saying that Lebanese makers of audiovisual films, again, videos, they moved to video because as if, right, there is a reluctance to promise depth, knowing that the earth that is Lebanon, right, the geopolitics that is Lebanon is again preoccupied by unnamed corpses. And again, how do you, and again for video makers, how do you make a video, how do you make a flat image, right, that is constantly longing to excavate, right, and produce depth? How do you make a video that always, in a sense, wants to exceed its shallow space, so that we can go back and excavate? I think this is the theoretically what Jalal is asking us to do, right? That we don't make video because we think it is better than cinema. We are making video because, in a sense, we cannot make cinema, right? We are now doing shallow images because we know that depth is no longer a place that is ours, unless somehow we make the effort, right, of excavation. And I always find that in Jalal's work, the notion of excavation is often alluded to, but he never goes there, because he's a writer, I find, who is interested in theorizing symptoms, right? It is like those epiphenomenon, what appears on the surface of the earth. But for him, a symptom, again, in a psychoanalytic model, right, always indicates a depth, although it perhaps cannot lead us to a source, right? This is the psychoanalytic model of the trauma, right? We have these symptoms, we don't know where they came from, but we know they came from somewhere. To make the journey back is almost like an invitation, but I find him more interested in the symptom. But again, if I think again of what has been produced in Beirut in the last 15 years, a lot of work, perhaps not in video, at least I'm not very versed in film and video, but I think in installation art, some interesting work has been done in terms of addressing the notion of excavating. Again, this is an example I always give, perhaps because there is not another, but I think Ziad Abi Lama's installation 1992 is an interesting example of someone who intentionally, in a sense, excavate by staging an event at what used to be called Chat de Général in Antilles. Right? So he goes there, makes installation, and addresses the notion of excavating, right? That what you're looking at is always connected to something underneath.
I wonder if you have an explanation why I chose the term ahistorical for this closure, because I mean, being an historian myself, I mean, I don't believe that there's anything that is kind of ahistorical, unless it is actually perceptions which can be ahistorical. And in this term, I mean, everything that he described, even Hiroshima, the explosion, is not an ahistorical rupture. It is something that was planned for and that has reasons that it happened. And I rather see there actually a disregard or even an unwillingness to face the proper reasons why things happened, and therefore a turning away of the glance and actually choosing to choose the flat screen instead of the depths maybe. But so what I see here is actually a shallowness in the analysis of Jalal, because he doesn't actually describe or explain why people, or I mean, he loses actually the track of explaining what this means in terms of dealing with the reasons for things. He simply finds a kind of similarly superficial explanation for a superficial dealing with past, you could say.
Again, but just technically, I don't think that he doesn't see in Hiroshima and Amur examples of an ahistorical eruption. He sees in that an example of a withdrawal of the tradition, that we no longer able to access the tradition that is nevertheless present and visible. A historical eruption, he gives the example of those photographs that are, Walid says, are unearthed in the Beirut city center. These unauthored, sudden apparition of artifacts, right? And of course, and I understand, perhaps I do not necessarily describe to your position exactly, but I understand that there's in Jalal's work perhaps a bias, again, towards the symptom. But again, if I would say, why did he use the term ahistorical, as far as I would go in terms of reading his text, is that for him what is ahistorical is again that which cannot be reinscribed in a narrative. Okay, it doesn't mean that it is it is not an epiphany, right? It's not a sacred apparition, but this inability to say that this thing that I see now before me, this artifact, this event, I don't know where it came from, but more importantly, I am not sure how to use it now, right? I think there's sometimes an overlooked novel written by Ilyas Khouri in the, I think, early 80s called Al-Wujuh al-Bayda, White Faces. For me, it's an important novel because, very briefly, it is, of course, it's a layered, narrative, but one of the layers tells of these corpses that appear next to trash cans in Beirut, right? If you like to use Jalal's pockets, these eruptions, right? And in Ilyas Khouri's novel, there's this other character, Job or Ayub, right? Who in the face of these apparitions has his patience, right? His patience, and his desire to write on the walls of the city, to somehow document things. But as you read the novel, there is, in the genre of that novel, there's a very conspicuous absence, and it is the absence of a detective. Right? Usually in these novels, it is the detective that, in a sense, comes to the corpse and then traces the way back. Therefore, we have the beginning, and then we can name the corpse, and then it can be buried, and then we finish the narrative. The absence of that detective makes that novel, I think, symptomatic of the Lebanese war. But I think perhaps interesting to read as another expression of living in a city, in a sense where very, very few things are accounted for. Like we get to talk politics, right? Nothing is accounted for here, right? Nothing is finished. And I like this idea that in Lebanon, nothing left, not even leaving. It's excess, right? It's always an excess. Nothing is resolved here. I mean, it's as far as I would probably defend Jalal's work, but I hear your point, and I think perhaps you should pursue that with him. Okay. Cool. Okay. I take responsibility for everything I said. You should check everything I said again with Jalal, right? Thanks again, thank you.
I have to precise that indeed we heard the lecture by someone who is not Jalal Toufic, as he introduced himself, but I think that Jalal Toufic was not wrong at all to ask Mr. Walid Sadek the artist to give to read the lecture. So I would like to applaud him still when he started.
Hi, Jalal Toufic.
Des filles comme moi, qui ne sont pas assez féminines. Madame, à 22.